brief introduction and then let Sarah take it away from there. Welcome everyone to the third lecture of our fall lecture series at the University of Texas School of Architecture. My name is Clay Odom. I am co-chair of the Lectures and Exhibitions Committee at the School of Architecture, along with David Heyman, and we're really pleased to welcome Jesse LeCavalier to the school. Just a couple of notes. It would be great if we could see everyone, at least at this point. So if you feel up to it, we would love to see faces. And I know as a lecturer, it's really nice to see the audience. So you can decide whether or not to leave your video on or off during the lecture, but it's great to see it now. And also during question time for sure. Feel free to leave it up during the lecture as well. It's totally fine. The next lecture in the series will be next Wednesday, September 30th. And we're really looking forward to that as well. Also, just in general, stay tuned to the SOA social media channels. And here's my daughter walking behind us. Welcome to Zoom. And stay tuned to the SOA social media channels for additional information about the lecture series, things going on at the school, and other events. So it's really a pleasure to welcome Jesse to the school, and also to have Sarah Lopez, Associate Professor, introducing Jesse. And take it away, Sarah. Thanks very much.
I'll keep it brief. I am really excited to hear more about sort of how Jesse LeCavalier puts his project, into a presentation like this. I'm a fan of his book, The Rule of Logistics, Walmart and the Architecture of Fulfillment. If you haven't read it, it's a good book. It's a great book, and it's one of the only books, if not the only book, or the forerunner of a book to ask these sorts of questions of the massive logistics infrastructure. I'm wondering, I don't need you to answer this now, Jesse. I'm wondering if you have a PhD student working on Amazon, and if so, I'd like to know who it is, and I'd like to read that project as well when it comes up. Also, because of Jesse's work, I went to Bentonville, Arkansas, so he has some great short essays as well as his book that you should all dip into and discover for yourselves as he shows us how fascinating places like Bentonville are as a part of this logistics infrastructure. I think he publishes in some of the most sort of fun architectural, they're intellectually rigorous, but they're also fun architectural publications: Cabinet, Public Culture, Places, Art Papers, Harvard Design. That's a really great collection of places to be publishing your work. And partly I think that is because of the innovation of his topic. I like to imagine that some of Jesse's innovation and creativity about thinking about architectural questions comes from his period as a PhD student or as a master's student at UC Berkeley. I know part of your education is at UC Berkeley, which I like to imagine it produces really great academics, since I can claim that that's also where I come from. So Jesse, we are so excited to have you here. I really look forward to our discussion, and thank you again.
Thank you, Sarah. It's really a pleasure, and yeah, and very much so. It's all people who get their masters or PhDs at Berkeley, brilliant people. But it's really it's such a nice opportunity to be here, and thank you for the introduction, and for you, everyone in the audience, thank you for joining. Of course, I'm sad that I can't be there in person. I was really looking forward to joining Sarah's class and having never been to Austin, getting to know the place a little bit. I would say that all of those of you in the audience who are at the School of Architecture at U of T, you're very lucky to have such amazing people in your faculty. So Dean Addington, Sarah, Nicole Wiedemann, Igor Siniki. These are just some of the people that I know personally, but there's an amazing group. So I really have a lot of admiration and enthusiasm for what you all are up to there. So I hope I can contribute to conversation today. So what I'll do is I'll share my screen and we'll get going, and then as much as we can, hopefully we have some time for, well, we will definitely have time for questions, but I'm looking forward to that part of it more for sure, because I think this is what's exciting, is to be able to bring all these things together. So hopefully you'll soon all see a big blue screen. Let's see if it's working. Big blue screen? Okay, cool. So this, the title of the lecture is Landscapes of Fulfillment. And I'll organize it in a few pieces. So I start with a kind of teaser about some of the ideas that have gone into the book and my work. And then I will unpack that book a little bit, talk a little bit more about some of the specific aspects of the book, and then two projects that are in progress. And so I thought I would use the occasion of Zoom, a format like this, to be a little bit more informal as much as that's possible. As you all know, I'm sure, painfully well, Zoom has a way of overdetermining formats. It produces a kind of formality and rigidity that's hard to overcome. But I hope that perhaps by presenting things in a bit more in progress, that maybe that will be a way to invite conversation. I also know that if any of you have spent time on Zoom, it can be a little bit, it reminds me of the scene in Interstellar. I don't know if you know it, where they're on this water planet for what seems like 10 minutes and they come back and like years have gone by. I sometimes feel like that on Zoom spaces. And so I will try to be as brief as I can. And I'm reminded of this when I was looking, because part of my research is about how bodies are enrolled in systems of control and how technology plays a part in that. And so in reading about different kinds of responses to online teaching in the pandemic, one new technology actually has developed a way to use some kind of AI system to try to figure out whether people are happy or bored in your class. And so you get these kinds of feedbacks from your monitor that will tell you, and this is for college students, but it goes all the way down to kindergarten also. So this is this moment for me that is kind of a terrifying moment as a reminder of the ways that technology is increasingly part of our lives. And to put this in a kind of larger context of logistics, I would say that we've always been, since the sort of arrival of certain kinds of mechanical technologies, we've been subjected to those. And so from the kind of beginning of photography, we become subjected to a mechanical vision. And so we then as humans become imagined as mechanical creatures. And in the early part of the century, as many of you probably know, I'm sure, that there were efforts to optimize the way we did our work to make our bodies mechanical. And that same quest for managerial precision has spread out to our environments. Here you see a drawing from a logistical manual about a warehouse showing the inventory and the building drawn in exactly the same way. But the more we demand, I'm sorry?
Sorry to interrupt you. There's a dialog box called build order in the screen.
Oh.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, thanks. That's weird. Let me see what's going on with that. It might be just popping. It might be a sort of hangover from an earlier. Let's see. Thanks. There it is. Thanks, Clay. Try that one more time. How's that? Yeah, we're not full screen yet. How's that? Dialog box gone? Okay, great. So we've been increasingly sort of enrolled in these environments, but remain bodily and but have tried to find ways to sort of overcome this. To what this image from the Sorcerer's Apprentice, suggesting that the helpers that we've conjured have their own landscape. This is a drawing of Amazon's robotic system, one of their patent drawings. All of this sort of effort to create to create these new systems is in support of a very irrational thing, which is consumer desire, and that's underpinned by these vast landscapes and vast technological and architectural landscapes, which are called fulfillment centers. And those centers create this whole process of fulfillment creates what we might call a kind of wilderness of machines that gets naturalized in lots of ways, where living systems get equated with machine systems through the language of logistics, the way we talk about how logistics flows, because indeed it can be hard to separate the human and the machine sometimes. And so this material flow betrays something that is not at all naturalized, that materials within logistical regimes don't flow at all. Of course, they're carried along at great cost and at great expense and at intense amounts of human labor. And so these entire landscapes have emerged to enable the movement of things, and that we call fulfillments. But just as our environment becomes more indifferent to us, our cities become increasingly modeled on the machines they house. So if you think about like a smart city, this is partly what I'm describing. And so part of the question from a design point of view for me was to say, what happens if we try to kind of like find space within these contradictions? So this image from Muybridge, for me, is really fascinating, because what it takes is it takes his sort of effort to catalog human motion and breaks it down. But what he's describing is someone falling down, a totally irrational thing. Like, it's really hard to make yourself fall down. And so here's someone falling really precisely. And I think this question about how we might take efficiency and sort of distort it or detourn it or redirect it to produce what we might call precise forms of efficient or efficient forms of absurdity became a driver for some design studies for the office, where we were looking at different ideas about human systems that wouldn't benefit from efficiency, like certain things that just don't get better if you are really efficient at them or really kind of mechanical about them. So like humor, or like dealing with your emotions, or being alone. The fact that the kind of irony of trying to escape but letting technology take care of you. All of this went into a design for what I was calling a center of fulfillment. So it was basically trying to take the double meaning of fulfillment as both the process of picking, packing, and shipping, but then also the idea of the sort of search for deeper happiness. And this produced a kind of fictional typology that would be both like wellness clinic and giant distribution center, as a way of sort of teasing out some of the strangeness of this term, because fulfillment becomes this thing that gets connected to a number of these different systems. And so the fulfillment and landscapes of fulfillment is these two meanings. One is the picking and packing and shipping of e-commerce, which is the sort of literal logistical landscapes of warehouses and the like. The other is fulfillment as a kind of process, like the process of bringing about satisfaction, usually with connections to deeper feelings of happiness or satisfaction. And so that question of happiness, in quotes, is connected, as we know, governmentally to financial success or GDP. So the way that national economies model their success usually hinges around the country's ability to its economic utility. And we've seen a few challenges to that in for example, like the New Zealand's well-being budget, for example. So underpinning that kind of fulfillment are infrastructures, generally infrastructures of extraction that move resources around, that pull resources out. Those tend to be linked to also practices of dispossession, and those things produce a feedback loop with this now established sector of the economy, which is the e-commerce sector, but also the logistical sector more generally. So those also, there are infrastructures of those logistics. And so one thing I'm curious about is, and these have been well described and documented, and I should have included Sarah's book in here, by people who are looking at it carefully at the way infrastructures work and the way infrastructures are part of these systems. And to some extent, these are also looking at alternatives. But that's what I'm curious about, which is what other values, what other forms of happiness, quote unquote, might we be able to pursue? So things that are related more to health and well-being rather than financial success or profit. And so what kind of personal or collective values could we support? And so these we might talk about as being supported by more like a nourishing infrastructure, or what a recent article from Deb Cowan and Winona LaDuke has described as an alimentary infrastructure, which I really love this idea, and I've been really fascinated. Like this gave a name for something that I've been looking for a long time. And so we know a little bit more about what these infrastructures look like, the infrastructure of extraction and these infrastructures of logistics. But what about these ones? What about these like alimentary or these nourishing infrastructures? What do those look like? How can we design them? And that's something that I'm really interested in trying to figure out, and to sort of find ways to pursue that, and to kind of join discussions about what that could look like. And so this is something that I want to try to unpack a little bit. If I had to summarize this, so there's this other kind of fulfillment that might emerge through this middle other value system here. And as a result, then we might start to reconfigure this diagram a little bit, where income might get directed back, or the kind of investments that a state might direct or not direct could then start to be focused on these other kinds of values. And so what I'd like to talk about today first will be more of these infrastructures of logistics, and then to speculate a bit about what the other kind might look like. So I'll start by looking at quickly some of the work I've been doing about Walmart, and then we'll talk about these two projects, one about the New Jersey Meadowlands and one about these food systems. If I had to translate that diagram into, I'm sorry, one more thing. So and I'll come back to these, but these are some of the traits I think that these kind of nourishing infrastructures might possess. Multi-scalar, multi-temporal, flexible, integrated, middle out, incremental, hybrid in their use, restorative, recuperative, regenerative, cyclical, metabolic, instead of extractive and unilateral or linear. If I had to translate this into meme, I might do something like this, where we might say, what I'm interested in is using architecture and urbanism to support more recuperative, regenerative, and restorative economies. So as Sarah mentioned, some of this research has gone into the production of this book, The Rule of Logistics. It uses the case study of Walmart to tell a bigger story about how logistics becomes a kind of determining factor and mindset across the whole of the company's operations. And that's fueled some other teaching efforts. And I just would momentarily make a little plug for a website that houses some of this research called Landscapes of Fulfillment, that's done in conjunction with some of my students when I was teaching at Yale, the Yale School of Architecture. And this has a series of projects related to different kinds of logistical frictions. So I just to make a little plug, if you're interested in learning more, you can find it at landscapesoffulfillment.org. But this emergence of logistics has happened through so in broad strokes, kind of transformations technologically, from industrialization to mechanization, now to automation and logistification. So to kind of use an example of New York City, if you think of the New York Harbor and Lower Manhattan as this active and thick edge of infrastructural interface with boats coming in and getting unloaded and break bulk shipping happening with people, these were sort of teeming spaces of both sort of active work, but also active graft and corruption. I mean, this was a real mess, but it was a vital mess. But nonetheless, it was like embedded in the city. And then now, if you consider the way that goods come into the city, it's through these automated systems that are in the port of New York, like in Bayonne here, and in Jersey City and Newark. You see the kind of landscape of pixelated containers and automated shipping cranes that process all of this in a highly automated way, but also produces this incredible amount of distance. And so this is sort of underpinning some of this shift to this logistical city, and that's even getting accelerated through the introduction of technology like the robot from Amazon system. And so one of the things that you all, I'm sure, are aware of in the moment that we're living through, and one I've been fascinated by, is the way that the supply chain, quote unquote, has been brought into popular imaginations through news coverage. So really, I think for me, it's been dramatic to hear since March, the way that the supply chain has become part of a news cycle in a way that it never was before at the same scale. So there was a lot of discussion about what the supply chain is, what it does, why it's working or not working, and to help listeners or readers understand that basically partly to kind of make people feel better that if there's this empty shelves don't mean that there's no food, it just means that we're buying more stuff than we were before, and that patterns are changing. But for me, this notion of the supply chain has been prominent, but I have a few issues. I have to borrow from Latour, I have 3 issues with the phrase global supply chain, the words global, supply, and chain. So global points to the way that kind of circuits of global capitalism have sort of distorted foodways beyond recognition. Supply, in this case, makes it seem like it's really an issue of availability, when really, with the context of food systems and with the breakdown during COVID, it's really about distribution more than it is about supply. And then the chain metaphor suggests that there's a kind of tidy linearity to this, when really this is a messy network of entanglements and contingencies that's much more brittle and much more complex than a chain might suggest. But I would like to show one clip of a television commercial from UPS that helps to describe the kind of expansiveness of how we might think of what logistics is. So I'm going to show you that, and this is part of their We Love Logistics campaign.
Logistics makes the world work better.
When it's planes in the sky for a chain of supply, that's logistics. When the parts for the line come precisely on time, that's logistics. A continuous link that is always in sync, that's logistics. Carbon footprint reduced, bottom line gets a boost, that's logistics. With new ways to compete, there'll be cheers on Wall Street, that's logistics. When technology knows right where everything goes, that's logistics. Bells will ring, ring, ding, ring, ding, ring, ding, that's logistics. There will be no more stress, cause you call UPS, that's logistics.
There's a lot to say about this commercial, but some of the things that I find really fascinating about the way that it's popularized have to do with the way that that this thing is presented as a system that's basically applied to the city, but then as a result transforms the city. And one of the characteristics of that commercial is this sort of chirp, this ubiquitous chirp, and that's the barcode being read. And the barcode is one of these key technical innovations that have transformed the logistics industry, and it's something that turns objects into information and makes objects into kind of spectral things, because what it does is it turns objects into data points, but then it also it makes information into something sort of palpable. And so I love this image because it's before pre-digital image of the barcode, of the hand actually compositing the barcode for to be photographed and then photostated to become part of the label. But it's a reminder of what the barcode is and how it's created as a series of linear bars of ones and zeros that then can be read by a laser. And people who studied the barcode have described it as the first language written by and for machines. And that I think is a really fascinating moment, and maybe a kind of watershed moment where there's this now other layer of information that's outside of our reach, even though we have created it in some ways. And that sort of abstraction that the barcode facilitates then spills out. And I showed this image briefly already, but I find this to be a really kind of emblematic image of the logistical mindset, which is that the inventory that logistics systems manage become conflated with the environments that they manage. And so the building here is drawn the same way that the units are drawn, the units of inventory. And so that abstraction, I think, is key to understanding the operations of Walmart. And so one of the things I tried to do with the book was to use different scales or levels of engagement and different technologies to try to understand how this operation worked. So starting from the kind of bodily scale to then the scale of buildings to then the scale of territory, all the way up to the kind of planetary scale. And for this lecture, I just will quickly tell you a bit about the buildings, but would be delighted to talk more about it in the Q&A portion. But one of the things for me that was significant is that Walmart uses a fleet of building types that become interrelated as part of their network. So one of them is the distribution center, and that basically routes all of the parcels into trucks that then shuttle back and forth between the supercenters, which then distribute those to consumers. And what I think is significant is how we understand boundaries in the context of Walmart. And so this is a drawing of the edge of the building, ostensibly. There's the blue edge of the tilt-up EFIS construction wall, but there's also the cash register. And in many ways, the register is really where the boundary of the system ends, because that's where you scan your product, and that's when it leaves the computer system in a certain way. So this is, in a certain sense, the kind of conceptual edge of Walmart's control, even though there's a physical level of control at the level of the building itself. So there are these sort of dual envelopes at work. And then what the barcode allowed Walmart to do was capture data. And some studies have suggested that Walmart is responsible for nearly 2% of the world's data. And so if you think about the scale of what they're doing, it's not out of reach. So just to sort of put Walmart in context, they're one of the largest corporations in the world, depending on how you measure it. They had an income last year of nearly $500 billion. So to the next highest is like Chinese state oil or something like that. So they're basically competing with global infrastructural concerns, but they're a retailer, and they basically sell Pop-Tarts and diapers. And this is really fascinating to me because they rely on buildings in this fundamental way. And all those buildings that are being visited by millions of people every day, scanning millions upon millions of products, all of that data goes somewhere and gets stored and gets used to make decisions about how to make more buildings. And all that has to go into these buildings here. This is a data center outside of Bentonville, which is built into the ground and really a kind of bunker and really infrastructurally articulated. So the language of these buildings, usually the system of warehouse structure is connected to the building envelope itself. So this is an example of storage becoming structure. This is rack supported warehouse. And one of the things that we're looking at the moment, that we're collectively, societally, we're looking at is the sort of automation of buildings. And that's most evident in something like Amazon's adoption of the Kiva robotic system for their robotic warehouses. And I really think this is an incredibly profound shift in the architectural condition. And it's a kind of post-Enlightenment architecture that we're looking at here, because imagine like a library. you bring the book back to the place it goes, it always is there. What's different here, and probably many of you know this if you're following Amazon, what we're looking at is a simulation of the warehouse floor, and every one of the colored squares is a small robotic drive unit that's bringing a shelf to someone who's the red and green flickering elements here. These are people unpacking the racks. And so what's happening is basically these robotic drive units are going to a place in the warehouse where there's an item being ordered, and then bringing that to the picker. What's different than a non-automated version is that when the robot is done, it doesn't go back to the place it came, it goes somewhere else, wherever it's most convenient. And the language of the patent describes this as a bidding process where the robots talk to each other and figure out, where there's an open, they talk to the warehouse management system and it says, here's where you should go. So what's significant here for me is this is an entirely scrambled set of information. We have no way as humans to understand this unless we have the kind of augmenting software that helps us decode this. And so there's almost this kind of Borgesian dimension to this, where if this thing broke down, like if we lost power, like we wouldn't be able to find our stuff anymore. And so so this is for me a really significant shift, because basically not only has the way we think about ordering information changed, the building itself is changing. This is an actively reconfiguring architecture that we're watching unfold in front of us. And so I think this is something that I've been trying to kind of wrestle with, and in a much more crude way, developed an installation that took the Walmart drawings from the book and used a series of Arduino-driven belts to create a kind of automated exquisite corpse drawing. So basically, we would have these belts that would cycle through in different intervals. And what occasionally would happen is these patterns would sort of snap together, and we might start to recognize certain hints of new building types or hints of new kind of creatures that were coming out of this process of a kind of borrowing from surrealist heuristic techniques to generate ideas. And so then we actually tried to me and some people in my office, we tried to rationalize these by actually making them into building types. And this started a process of thinking about how the language of logistics could become translated into other contexts. And this also is connected to the qualities of these interiors, which happen to be quite dazzling in their effect because of the sort of vastness and repetitiveness. And it turns out that one of the things that makes the leanness of the supply chain possible is an incredible amount of flab or slack in the material world. So in order to be operating a just-in-time system, you have to have this incredible amount of surplus material. And so this is what, this is an image of a pallet rack. The pallet rack is this kind of robust thing, and there's so much, there's just like this incredible surplus of these because companies need to be able to quickly reconfigure warehouses. And so those pallet rack became a kind of driver for a project when I was a finalist for the PS1 Young Architects program, we became interested in the pallet rack as a building block for the courtyard. For those of you, so the PS1 courtyard was an annual competition to occupy the courtyard of MoMA's Contemporary Art Museum in Queens, which is like a 15,000 square foot warehouse courtyard. And the goal was the requirement is to make a temporary structure for a somewhat limited budget. And so what we found was that the pallet rack became this really robust and flexible tool to create this really immersive environment within the means of the competition. And so basically working with this company called Heads Up in New Jersey, they were willing to lend us hundreds of these pallet racks for the summer. And then once we were done, they would just go back into the logistical stream. So it was a kind of temporary redirecting of this material abundance to produce a different kind of effect than would otherwise be available in the warehouse. And so we then organized it around a series of linear of aisles and then clearings. So we were using a lot of like forest metaphors, so clearings and pathways, canopies. And so that produced what we were calling these are the racks. And then within that, a series of custom built furniture became stacks, and then tracks above that would create guidance and lighting. And this is how it lands in the courtyard. And so these are the three components. And one of the things that was interesting about the stacks I found was the warehouse, the racks are not human, are not proportioned to humans, and so making furniture inside them produced this very kind of like almost like gargantuan scale in a way that was fascinating. And so these are some of the renderings about trying to conjure the effect that we were interested in, and it produced this kind of diffuse shaded condition, which is important for the hot summer New York summers. And then at night it would cool down to form a backdrop for the concert series. And so this is the daytime as it produces this kind of dense space. And our idea was that it would be something you would discover you could only really discover by immersing yourself in it. We were not selected, but the principle of this, I've continued to try to develop because what's really important here are the relationships between the pieces, not so much the form. The form is pretty adaptable. And in that sense, we were trying to borrow some of the logic of the prototypes from Walmart. And so so with that's some very quickly some of the ways I've tried to take the research into logistics from the book about Walmart and to apply that to some design ideas, both sort of heuristically around trying to generate ideas for drawings, but also ways for thinking about built environment and spaces in the context of the PS1 project. And now with the second part, which I think will be faster, I would love to tell you about two projects that are really in progress. And so they're neither of them finished, but both in progress and both related to questions of logistics, but trying to apply them to different contexts and with different outcomes. So one is a project that I'm calling Natures of Logistics, and it's centered on the New Jersey Meadowlands, which is fundamentally a landscape of fulfillment. It's a site of intense transformation and movement of information and of people and of energy and of waste, of data, of goods. It's this incredibly active metabolic landscape. And it's also one that's been sort of historically unbuildable in the city. And it's right next to Manhattan. It's basically the kind of like infrastructural backyard of Manhattan. And so one of the motivating questions for this first is to just sort of understand how it's working as an infrastructure. And then the second is to try to think about how a civic form might emerge that would be attendant to some of the specificities of this place. It happens to be one of the most polluted landscapes on the planet. There's every other parcel is a Superfund site almost, so it's incredibly contaminated. But it also is a fascinating landscape of it's a really impure nature in a way that I find really compelling. And so for example, on the left, this is a kind of diagram showing the intertwined ecology of this area. It's a big estuarine marsh, so it's the zone, intertidal zone between the New York Harbor and then the Hackensack and Passaic rivers. And on the right, you see this image of a retaining wall as part of like a TGI Fridays parking lot. And then on the right of that image, the grasses are the Phragmites grasses that are a non-indigenous, a rampant non-indigenous species that are incredibly powerful at mitigating pollution. And so you have this already kind of complex relationship here where you have a what we might call a kind of invasive species that actually is doing incredibly useful work in terms of dealing with contamination and stabilizing the soil, but also is like crowding out a lot of the more indigenous plant population. So you have this very impure nature. It also is a very vulnerable place. It was inundated during Hurricane Sandy, and then it was. You can see the response on the right has been the kind of least inventive response you can think of, which is really just to build a big wall around your corporate enclave. But this is one of the challenges of dealing with being here. It also is the site. You might not have known this. This is the host. The site of the American Dream is outside of New York in the New Jersey Meadowlands. Take a left here. It is the site of this ongoing shopping mall complex kind of boondoggle that was once called Xanadu. Now it's called American Dream. After a decade roughly of starting and stopping, they finally managed to open March 1st of this year. So it was it's been a complex project, but it's just to say that this has been a site of incredible investment in entertainment as well. So there's a kind of cultural dimension to the Meadowlands. Culturally, there are other contexts. So this is Robert Smithson is from Patterson. His famous tour of the monuments of Passaic is a bus tour through this area, and is this amazing exercise in misreading the infrastructural landscape as a series of monuments to a civilization. And in that essay, Smithson meditates about time and industrial decay and looks for ways to think about finding expression here. And I find this to be really, really, it's a compelling layer to this site, but it remains sort of uncrystallized, let's say. His partner, Nancy Holt, has a proposal for one of the landfill sites that was never realized, but use one of these landfills to create a kind of like sort of fundamental, like sort of geomantic observatory that would connect the place to the cycles of the sun and season. And so I think there's something really fitting about this in the context of something like the Meadowlands. So on top of an artificial mound of garbage, you would then create this observatory that would link this place to the kind of fundamental aspects of like human condition. So unfortunately, this was never realized, but it remains sort of present in the imagination of the place. And so what we've been undertaking, again, me and some people working with me in the office, is a series of inventories of the place by first trying to understand the kind of infrastructural types. So one is first just to understand the place. So this is the Hackensack River here, the Passaic River, Newark is up here, and then this is Carney Point, which is an old shipyard. And then there's a series of infrastructural layers. So radio towers, it's one of the most active sites of radio broadcasting in the area. Energy storage, so this is where the transcontinental pipeline, this is how how New Jersey is connected to Texas, is through this pipeline. And then, of course, landfills. This is where New York brought its waste that then have been, most of these are not active anymore, they've been capped. And so altogether, this forms a kind of landscape of infrastructural installations, but that's really just these sort of objects. And one thing that we've been trying to do more recently is to understand what we've been calling an atlas of invisibility, where we've been looking at all the different layers of infrastructural organization that maybe hidden away. And so these include contamination. It's hard to see. So we've been mapping where the sites are most contaminated, where the water has been manipulated or impounded, where there's subsurface conditions that are more stable or not, where habitat has been carved up, of course, where the landfills are, which parcels are owned by whom, which is this incredible mosaic of different competing ownership, and then where there might be solid ground versus marshy ground. All of that together allowed us to identify what we call hotspots that had sites that would intersect with a number of those layers to then develop a series of prototype development, which I'll talk about in a second. And so part of this was trying to translate this infrastructural system into a more legible model. And so we've been calling this a recognition manual, using the kind of naval or military model where you would develop a silhouette for quick recognition of something. And this is part of a project that will eventually go into the PATH trains, which are the commuter trains that go through the area, so that people riding in the trains could look out and understand, kind of what they're seeing, or quickly understand the difference between, say, a natural gas storage tank and a water tank or a petroleum tank. So you could quickly sort of develop a vocabulary for infrastructural distinction. And these are those posters that will eventually be installed. But this gave us a kind of graphic language. And as we were doing this, we also became attentive to the kind of infrastructural installations that were dotting the landscape, and also became points of reference for us as we were driving around, it's a fairly difficult place to navigate. There are not a lot of landmarks or ways to see things, because until you become more kind of trained in it. So we found ourselves finding certain kind of landmarks that we would use to navigate, like this drawbridge, for example. So we undertook a process of drawing those and then developed a kind of a kind of catalog of these as well, because they're also really amazing. These kind of drawbridge houses and the broadcasting stations, the storage facilities. And that gave us an initial language for developing these sites. And so in parallel to that, we've been developing what we've been calling a third nature field guide. So in the spirit of field guides, but to say that there's a kind of compromise, not compromise, but there's a hybrid condition here where nature here is not kind of first nature of wilderness or a second nature of cultivation, but is really a kind of third nature that becomes unruly in its own. And so we're borrowing that from people like Anna Singh, who are looking at different kinds of emergent conditions that are a hybrid of human, natural, industrial, as we're trying to develop this catalog. And then part of this is an ongoing project that eventually will hopefully become a publication. And so we'll be working with the photographer Naho Kubota she'll be documenting some of these sites as well as we go forward. So I'm really happy. I'm quite I'm very grateful and honored to be able to work with her. I really admire her work. And so that's all fed into what we've been calling test sites for minor infrastructure. So we've been developing, we have 16 of these sites, and some of them are within those, they're all in these hotspots that I was describing. And so I'll just talk about two quickly to give you a sense of what we're trying to do. And so we developed this language, this formal language that then gets deployed into a site, and then these sites could become ways of activating, let's say, public access, but then also might become active as remediative infrastructure. So things that could actually work to help with dealing with the contamination of the site through in situ processes. So rather than taking contaminated soil away, which is often what happens, this would be through keeping it here and slowly transforming it over a kind of durational timeline. And so this would be a way of starting to create new connections to transit, and then also like a future visitor center for the Meadowlands. So the site is between two rail lines, but they're not actually connected. Here you have to go to Secaucus Junction to do it. So this would be a way of facilitating that, but then it would also create new gathering areas that would either be for cultural events or for observation or for sort of public use, like the boat launch deck. So it's a kind of multi-purpose infrastructure that's derived from some of the research into the formal properties of this place. And then similarly, this is another one of these moments here where within the network, I should have added, within the network of the whole Meadowlands, there are these few points where there's like some missing links. And if those pieces could be connected, you would have this incredibly, you would be able to navigate the entire region. But right now, because of just a few points, you can't do that. And this is one of them. So this is a proposal for a kind of boathouse and fish refuge area to help with support for sort of multi-species access, because so much of the environment here has been carved up. And this would be a way to hopefully support that transformation. And so you can see the plan, it includes piers and a little sauna. So I mean, we've been having fun thinking about a language, but we've been trying to do this with the forms in mind that we've been looking at. And the idea we hope is that these things would feel eventually like part of the place through their resonance with the infrastructural language, let's say, of the place. And so this was, currently have a proposal out to instantiate this as a small exhibit. And this is where the life of the PS1, the unfulfilled PS1 project, finds its way again into this proposal, which I hope we can do, which would basically create a little, an exterior exhibition space and then a small interior gallery where Naho's photos will be displayed along with the big model. So the idea is that you would have this little inner sanctuary that you would discover upon arriving at this place. And this is the sort of overview of this project that's currently in progress. Sarah, how are we doing on time?
So let's see, it is, I think actually, if we want to get some questions in, it might be, Clay, not if you're agreeing with me, that it might be a good time to move, or Clay, do you think, because it's 1:53?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a little bit of time. We have time for questions. We have time for you to wrap up, Jesse. It's kind of in your court. We typically end around 2, but we can extend beyond them for sure. 2 to 2:30 would be fine.
Well, I'd love to hear some questions. So maybe I'll just, what I have actually is quick. I have maybe just 2 more minutes, and then we can we can talk. So I won't go into detail about this, but it's the thing I'm working on now, and it's actually fine to conclude here quickly because this is quite rough, but it's been research I've been doing over the summer about all of the food system breakdowns during COVID. And I think what's really important to say here is that the food system has never been very good. It's not breaking down because of COVID. COVID has exposed what's already a badly formed system that's brittle and inflexible and non-integrated. And so what's happened with the pandemic is all of that has been exposed because of the demand shock as people are buying a bunch of stuff quickly. We're seeing a lot of the incompatibilities that have always existed, and those things are now becoming increasingly evident. And so over the summer, I've been looking at these different two parts of this, one, the kind of failures, and one, the responses. And the failures have been largely about different kinds of formatting issues, and what we tried to do here was make two kinds of distinctions between the point of a breakdown and the consequences of that breakdown. So for example, in Toronto, there was a shortage of flour, not because there wasn't enough flour, but because the company didn't have enough bags for consumers. So they have plenty of bags for restaurants that are 50-pound bags of flour, not enough for 1-pound bags for the store. And they couldn't retool their machines quickly enough to meet the demand. And so they ended up, there was this lag as a result. And so that's a sort of symptom of a kind of inflexible system, let's say. Peanuts, for example. Virginia peanuts are sold at ballparks, mostly, exclusively. And so Virginia peanut farmers are not turning their Virginia peanuts into peanut butter, which is in high demand at food banks because they can sell them, hopefully, in their mind, next year at baseball games. So it's worth it for them to sit on them rather than to translate them into peanut butter for people who are hungry and need them now. And so this is a kind of symptom of some of the strangeness of how foodways work, where profit is interfering with need. And we might call this something like upstream specificity, where the commodity doesn't have an ability, it's not worth it for the farmers to try to jump streams. There's a lot of examples like this. French fries, you've probably seen stories about farmers plowing under their crops because it's cheaper for them to lose the crop than to pay for its processing or to flood the market with it. So it exposes a lot of these dynamics. Meat processing is a whole other story around not just the product, the commodity, but the process of meat packing, as are the chickens. And so we've been doing work on trying to understand the flows of these things to see where vulnerabilities have emerged. And then we've been looking at trying to find inventive responses. And so using retooling school buses to deliver lunches. You maybe have followed 11 Madison Park, one of the sort of quote best restaurants in the world, closed and became a commissary and basically became a soup kitchen to feed people who needed food. And it's a really amazing story that's, of course, also great for the restaurant because they get this sort of visibility, but it's a noble transformation. So these have all come together, and this has been a way to try to understand a series of principles that for me would be ways to think about a different model for the food system. And I'm currently working on developing some food hub prototypes in the sort of Great Lakes region, starting with Rochester and the Erie Canal, with inspiration from groups like Ghetto Gastro, who are looking at how food banks don't need to become, how those could become vital community hubs if they're programmed inventively rather than maybe the way they're seen currently. And the Erie Canal, of course, is a totally amazing history of a kind of multi-species infrastructure with people and mules and boats using waterways, which are much more less resource intensive to deliver things. And so this is the image of what is no longer existing, but this amazing bridge that's an aqueduct over the river. So you have one river bridging over another river in Rochester, and reading all sorts of hybrid typologies. And so to just conclude, I think some of the things that I think are exciting here to think about for me are different models of infrastructure that would breed this kind of multi-scalar and multi-temporal, integrated, flexible, et cetera, as we try to figure out how to make a case for viable alternatives to the kind of extractive models of infrastructure that we know. So with that, I will end. Thank you so much for your attention and your sitting through the Zoom format. It's really I know it's a long time. It doesn't seem long on my side. It goes by quickly, but I appreciate your attention, and I'd love to talk to you.
Great, thank you, Jesse. So for those of you who are still with us, I'm going to hold my questions. I have plenty, but if you have a question, just go ahead and raise your hand either with the in the participants, or even you can just go like this. And if I see you, or if Clay or Leora sees you, they will let me know. One of the things, I'm going to chat a little while you're thinking. As soon as I see a hand, I will silence myself. One of the things that I find fascinating about your work, Jesse, is the way the pieces relate to each other. So you did the logistics project with Walmart to start, and you have this way of imagining and dealing with a scale that frightened many of us. And then you've moved to 2 projects that keep you at that scale. You're really attacking things at these massive scales. And one of the things I appreciate is that I feel like you're trying to render like visible and almost even maybe accessible a scale that feels invisible and inaccessible. And I think that's a bit of a continuous theme potentially amongst your projects. So that's a comment, that's not a question. Okay, I'll go ahead and ask since I don't see any hands. I'm just gonna go ahead. Okay. One of my questions about the Walmart project is these infrastructures, can they be undone? Now we have such an overlapping and overlaying and a building upon a kind of way of viewing efficiency and a kind of, it's linked to this massive accumulation of capital for the people who are stewarding these systems. Can they be undone? And what would the undoing of this way of building logistics infrastructure, what would that mean? And sometimes I think the reason I'm asking that question is because when I think about politics, and I think about the relationship between political actors, nation states, and when you think about political conflict, it's a historical overlaying that even if you change a policy, it's not like that conflict can just be undone. And somehow I almost see the logistics infrastructure as creating a logic and a kind of space that has so transformed how we do things that there isn't a going back. I'm thinking, for example, of a New York Times article that talked about Baltimore City as a city that's been transformed by the presence of Amazon. So not just the fulfillment center, but the way that actually sort of politically and urbanistically, the cities are responding to these fulfillment center and these logistics infrastructures. So that's one question for you. Another question I have is about historical precedent, which is, is the historical precedent for this the supermarket? I see the logistics infrastructure architecturally and spatially as being so innovative. But if I try to think about, what is the historical precedent, I think of the supermarket, building off of the grocery store, and the way that the barcode and a kind of proto-logistics infrastructure, maybe in a post-World War II period, got built up. And I'm wondering if that link has been an interesting one for you to explore, or if you've found there to be other kind of historical antecedents to this. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Sorry, thank you. These are great questions. It's makes it all the more sort of poignant that we can't just like keep talking about all this stuff in person, but I hope that we can continue the conversation in general. But I think that maybe I start with the second question. I think the question of historical precedent is really key. And I would say for me, methodologically, really important to situate any kind of interest in sort of technological transformation historically, because it helps to understand maybe what might seem like something really dramatic, to make it feel less, to just situate it better. So, yeah, I think the supermarket is one precedent. There's the kind of lineage of retail formats from the emergence of self-service in the 1920s, but also the kind of mail order format, and then the supermarket as the kind of intervening in the process of warehousing and distributing. Another precedent, which I think is on my mind a lot when I look at Walmart, is the railroads. And that actually is a kind of one of the big infrastructural transformations of the continent. And by looking at that, it makes Walmart seem less dramatic in a way, because it would sort of, like, if Walmart was working at the scale of the railroad, it would almost like be as if Walmart was not only doing all the stuff they're doing, but also building their own freeways, for example. So like imagine that, like imagine if Walmart built its own interstate system to deliver things. Instead, they use the one publicly funded by all of us, which is, you know, another sort of problematic aspect of what they do, is that they are taking advantage of this publicly funded system to then to fulfill their operations. But I think that they're working at that more sort of system scale, and so that's where I think where scholars of these kind of large technical systems and historical transformations have been really influential and useful for me to understand the role of like the systems building enterprise. And I think Amazon is also a kind of is building a system rather than let's say delivering like a product. And so, for example, as people have looked at Edison and the light bulb, like the light bulb we think of as like the product, but part of the sort of genius of Edison was to make delivering electricity the real innovation. So the light bulb is the way, it's like the index of that system. And so I think that's where, you know, to your earlier comments, I mean, about scale, I mean, I think I appreciate those. I mean, I think that's been one of the challenges, is to think about how design can connect to these. And so one of the ways I've been trying to think about that is how at certain scales, certain things reflect or mark or index those kinds of systems. So like the barcode for me is so key that way, because it's this sort of like reminder of what system you're participating in every time something is scanned. And so I think with the question of like, you know, how do these things get undone, or what do we do about them? I mean, to some extent, COVID is undoing them right now, which is, and then also the administration is undoing them in one way, but then reinforcing them in others. And so I think that optimistically, one of the things I hope could come out of this whole mess of the pandemic is some undoing of these systems, because it's helping people understand the vulnerability and the precarity of for example, like food systems. But what I wouldn't necessarily want to see come out of that would be a kind of insistence on a kind of like localism exclusively, because I think that it's not either or. I think that there's a necessity to understand the relationships between larger systems of like food distribution, for example. I think that where we're, and I think that's where we really need to undo them are places where there's really systematic exclusion of access to resources. You know, what the sort of food exclusion zones where these systems are actively perpetuating the access to like cheap, unhealthy food and not better systems. But I think that there's a point. I think your question is really important about what it means to undo something, and I think that would be for me. I would be interested in like following up that way. Like, what are the mechanisms of sort of undoing? And how might you start to unravel these things? You know, so is it in the spirit of, let's say, like Easterling's suggestion that we act in more kind of sneaky ways to inhabit the circuits of power that logistical systems create, or is it in a more symmetrical way? I mean, I think this article I was talking about elementary infrastructure from Deborah Cowan and Winona LaDuke is really inspiring, but it tends to then still sort of say, well, it's still about like some large scale infrastructures. And so I think that undoing might be more about working in parallel to me, you know, like not so much like undoing systems, but finding alternatives that can operate alongside them, and that through posing sort of plausible counter options or alternative options, that the undoing might happen more through sort of atrophy than through like an active dismantling I think that for me, it would be like, as many sort of fronts as possible to work on this. And I think that it's an interesting question about whether there's like a threshold that gets crossed. Basically, there's a point where something is sort of like too big to be undone. And I think go ahead.
As these logistic systems have accumulated and gotten more robust, in parallel with that, other systems have been forgotten and abandoned. Mm-hmm. And I think it's interesting to sort of ask about those two transformations at the same time, because if you want to toggle back and forth between the systems, at what point is that not an option anymore? And then what needs to be rebuilt or built anew to have alternatives? So I don't think it's necessarily about like local scale versus mega macro scale, but it's about multiple kinds of systems. And if you have, a logistics system becoming a monopoly, what does that mean about the other competitive competitor systems? And what does that mean about sort of forgetting? It's the forgetting. And the way that forgetting is spatialized, so that like literally you can't do the other thing because it no longer takes place.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's so key. And I mean, that's probably been my fascination with like the Erie Canal, which of course was like a huge top-down infrastructure, but now sort of non-functional. Well, it's also the barge canal system anyway, but the idea that you would have this kind of waterway system of distribution that would basically be just as effective. But I mean, it's this sort of story of infrastructural. What you're summarizing is so well is a kind of history of infrastructural displacement. And I think so, like, the story of the streetcar getting erased by the automobile, or the story of any kind of given technology getting left behind as things get consolidated. The freeway system, one version of it getting adopted at the expense of all these other more flexible systems. And so I think this is partly where designers can be so useful, because I think we can first keep reminding ourselves and everyone else that there were other models, and that those have been maybe left behind, but not because of any good reason, but because one system won out, partly because of some way of lobbying for its victory, but then also to keep thinking about other models that could be possible. And so I think this is where articulating the features of those systems is really key. And I think this is where the Amazon question is like really important, because it's a different model than Walmart, certainly, but it's increasingly becoming so embedded that it might become difficult to imagine another alternative. One of the things I love about Toronto is that it still kind of exists in a slightly pre-Amazon paradigm. Wow. So like I live next to a bookstore. It's amazing. It's like I live next to a record store. It's like really astonishing. And they still function as kind of community places. So I think this is something that we also have to kind of, be active in preserving.
Great. Lalitha?
Yes, hi. Can you hear me? Yes, okay, great. Hi, I'm an interloper. I'm in film studies, so I'm a theorist and philosopher, but here I am. So I love the conversation and Sarah's response to you on Walmart. I have a couple of questions to ask in a slightly different direction. Since we're actually talking about Walmart and Amazon as logistics, I was wondering if the other model over there would be IKEA, which comes from a German kind of like a very different set, but it also believes, I'm going to call it big box in my head, right? It also has a similar kind of a structure of modularity, etc., right? So there is that. And something happens with these structures that everything squares up, right? So that's part of what it is. Whether you've got the grid or the loft, it seems insistent on a kind of cardboard economy. The second thing, which I'm curious, is when Sarah mentioned the supermarket, I was thinking, and you're talking about extraction economies, I was much more interested, not much more, but I would say I was equally interested in the question of storage, because none of these things would function without storage. And it's not any kind of storage, it's climate control storage, it's air conditioning. And all of this has actually been sort of like vile for the environment. So is there a way of, because when you land up building these humongous structures, one is actually talking about the kind of levels of emission, right? It's a bit like what happens with large scale airports, which now seems to be what most nation states are building, enormous airports, right? The ports have gone, but We've actually got enormous airports everywhere. But the idea of walking into a Walmart or walking into, well, I haven't worked on an Amazon, but you get these air-conditioned blasts, right? And they're by themselves. And so there is a notion of not only that, it goes directly to American homes that have huge refrigerators that in turn store more. So there's this endless idea of storing, which is the kind of an aesthetics of storage and hoarding, which is what we've seen around COVID. So what happens, it's not just logistics. It's not as if we can just go to one of these large box stores and just sort of say, I'll buy myself a couple of toilet paper rolls. No, you have to buy for the entire year or something. So can you actually talk about it? Because I feel like extraction economies are very much part of what Marx would call primitive accumulation, right? So we're actually very much in that space of something, constant accumulation. Okay, and the demonstration of that accumulation. Okay.
Thank you so much for the question and for joining the talk. Yeah, I mean, they're great questions. I think well, so let's see. So storage. I mean, one way to maybe think about like storage and the kind of spaces of storage, I think it depends, of course, on like what you're storing. And so for from like, let's say the sort of Walmart logistics manager point of view, and the ideal situation in a kind of lean supply chain context would be to have no storage. That goods would never sit still, that they would be in a kind of constant state of movement from supplier to consumer, because when they sit still, they occupy kind of dead real estate space and it's costing you something to hold them. So storage becomes a liability in these contexts, and reducing storage is the kind of goal for so many. So like the big warehouse distribution center I was showing the drawing of, that one is like 1 million square feet. And it's probably the shelves are probably 20 feet high. And then when I was taking a tour of one of them, the manager described how that entire volume turns over in 24 hours, but you never notice it because it's sort of like if you fill your bathtub up and take the plug out, but leave the water running, the level will seem the same, but there's a huge amount of turbulence. So there's all this movement going on. And so, but if food gets different, and food is weird because there's, because of sort of demand for it that's been created, then the perishability of it requires it to be, of course, like harvested, like bananas are harvested like, like 3 weeks under ripe, brought into artificial environments to be irradiated with gas to then ripen quickly, and so that produces this other kind of footprint. But I think there's amazing. There's been amazing work. I mean, Nicola Quilly's work comes to mind about cold storage, or Michael Osmond's book about regulation has an amazing chapter on cold storage as this thing that was like terror, that was really a kind of terror to producers because they saw it as an unfair manipulation of the commodity, because basically it was effectively slowing down time. And so things that would normally have to get to market right away could then get banked or could get manipulated. And so as a result, like futures markets got totally transformed because you could sort of predict things in a different kind of way through the architecture. And so I think it's definitely, I mean, it's a huge part of the story. And I think for me, I think it's, you're right to, I mean, for me, I haven't totally figured out the relationship, in my own work between, these kind of infrastructures that support like living and the kind of extractive models. I mean, that maybe is linked to, like to more kind of primitive resource use, like the kind of pipelines and things like that, literal extractions, but then also, I think, to what extent do we think about Amazon as a kind of form of extraction infrastructure in terms of the things that it's pulling out of the communities that it's in, even though it's not sort of like trading in commodities or transforming elements. So one of the other things to keep in mind, I think it's why one of the reasons I really appreciate your question is that storage remains in effect. I mean, and of course, in the kind of way upstream of all of these supply chain processes. So the goods that Amazon deals with, like Amazon doesn't manufacture things, it facilitates the availability of things, but it has to get them from producers, and those things have to be transformed from raw material, which is why IKEA, this is maybe a segue to the IKEA question, IKEA is an interesting model because they have a lot more control upstream of their raw materials. So but they're also a kind of in-house, what they make what they sell, versus Amazon doesn't make what they sell. They sell all sorts of other things. And so IKEA designs and sells, but also controls the commodities way up the production stream. So including sort of like having control over like forests, so they can make sure they have enough trees. They have a whole subset of IKEA is just to produce their composite lumber, the kind of flat pack wood kind of slurry that is basically every IKEA furniture is made of that stuff. And then they have they do have incredible sort of innovations in the like the flat pack of IKEA is one of their major innovations logistically because it reduces the cost of shipping. So one of the ways that things become so cheap at IKEA is because you can pack it all. If anyone knows the consequences of that, if you try to carry it out of a store, it's super heavy because it's all densely packed. It's basically like half a tree is in your cart as you're moving it out of the store. So I would put IKEA, I would say IKEA is less of a kind of system build. I mean, to my mind, in this kind of schema, that IKEA is less of a kind of systems builder in the way that like Amazon or Walmart is, but they're a really innovative producer in terms of how they connect design and production to the thing they're trying to do. And they also are more enlightened, I would say, within this context of giant corporations are doing, I would say, whatever, less damage somehow, but it's still a huge enterprise, obviously. But I think it's a slightly different category, I would say, but totally fascinating. I have a whole, actually, if you'd like, maybe I can get your contact. I can send you an article I wrote about IKEA's furniture design line, and they've had this whole sort of like totally fascinating like boutique line that they do every few years, where they commission young designers to do like limited runs, and the kind of the marketing apparatus around that is totally fascinating about what IKEA seems to be and what they're telling you it is. So maybe I would love to talk to you more about all this stuff.
Great. We do have a question from YouTube. Do you think if these logistical, what?
I mean, I've never had a chance to talk to YouTube before. So
yeah, it's direct from YouTube. Do you think if these logical machine systems were restructured more like intuitive human systems, possibly with AI, this treatment of human-like cogs in a machine could be reversed?
Well, I mean, I guess it's sort of, for me, that I tend to not think sort of in like these sort of either or questions, I mean, I think that sorry, will you repeat the first part just so I can?
Do you think if these logical machine systems were restructured more like intuitive human systems, possibly with AI, the treatment of humans like cogs in a machine could be reversed?
Mm-hmm. Right. So how does a sort of fulfillment system become more intuitive? And I mean, yeah. So I'm not sure if it's like necessarily would be like reverse, but I mean, I think it is important to think about what will likely become more and more of our reality as computer systems advance, and the systems that we voluntarily, that we choose to sort of participate with, become more attuned to our habits. That will start to happen. I mean, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I guess I'm thinking of Walmart examples that they are, it's not necessarily at a level of kind of AI sophistication, but there are, well, within fulfillment, there's this level of AI sophistication that's being pursued around simply the ability to sort things, but at a larger scale, and that's, I think, at the scale of fulfillment, one of the challenges has been to figure out how to supplant the sort of human's ability to make quick decisions and the kind of dexterity of human handling. Those are sort of the big technological obstacles that it's just like hard for robots to figure out which is which, and hard to pick things up in a quick way. Humans are really good at those things. And so, but I think that as the systems become more intuitive, I guess that would mean sort of anticipating sort of desires. And I guess that's one of the things that, I mean, we could look at whether Amazon's algorithms that suggest what we want is doing that yet, if that's reversing anything, or if that's just facilitating faster consumerism. I tend to be sort of skeptical about redemptive possibilities of technology. So I would say no.
Jesse, one great lecture and great discussion here. I think one question I have relative to actually this line of questioning that you're engaging is this notion of redirection that you used in the PS1 proposal, because it seems like that as a sort of instrument to sort of engage these questions, that's the most sort of like direct kind of engagement of the whole logistical stream to create these moments of inefficiency that become a humanizing kind of like force in the logistical stream. And maybe that links up a little bit to your sort of description of the Kiva system and how it operates at a sort of pace and scale and in sort of a pattern that humans aren't able to sort of engage necessarily. So maybe to the last question, do you think that perhaps like the squeezing out of these sort of micro moments of inefficiency might be the way to sort of humanize these logistical infrastructures? That is, if we just say that they're going to be here regardless, which is kind of my position. Like, I think it's going to be hard to overturn them, but it might be able to sort of squeeze slivers of humanity out of them in certain positions, right, or in certain conditions, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it totally makes sense. I mean, well, I mean, maybe you could tell me more about what, like, when you say humanity, like when you like squeezing humanity out of them. I mean, like what? Like
I mean, just in sort of how you, I mean, humanizing kind of moments, like just in the use of the shelving system in the PS1, you sort of tease out other kinds of effects that were about immersion and human interaction and these kinds of other pieces, and maybe also in the work in New Jersey is similar, where you're starting to use infrastructural tools to generate new kinds of infrastructures that engage different aspects of the world.
Yeah, right. I see. I mean, I think that, I mean, for the PS1 project, I mean, one of the things that was really for me compelling was that collision actually between a system that was not at all designed for inhabitation, and to then see that run up against like a sort of challenge to inhabit it and the weird things that would emerge if you did that. And so and you know, whether that would make it more human or humanized or not, but more rather like how that would sort of either, I mean, help either reveal the kind of incompatibilities or show opportunities for those kinds of connections. I mean, I think that maybe one way to respond to, I think it's a great question. One way to maybe I could think about responding to is around, it's still connected to Sarah's question about history a little bit, because I mean, like with Amazon, I mean, I tend to be, I tend to agree with you in general that the kind of cycles of how we get things will be changed by the presence of being able to quickly shop online, and I think that I do think that we can easily unlearn the desire to get something overnight, but I think that there is something that is increasingly, you know, pervasive about the kind of convenience of what Amazon delivers. So, but maybe two things about that. First is that, like, what Amazon is important to maybe remember or think about, because it's important. I think for me, it's important that we don't think of Amazon only as something that delivers objects to people. One of Amazon's largest income sources is their web service hosting. So they figured out how to scale up their data organization. So now they're supplying data, as probably you know. I mean, they're the servers for the CIA and for NASA and for Netflix. So this is Amazon as a system building infrastructural organization. You know, they're not only doing that, but they're also producing award-winning media content. So you know, just to, because I think for me, I can easily think of Amazon as like the box that arrives at my door, but really it's this kind of much more unruly kind of system that's influencing how we store our data, how we move our data around, how we consume information, how we are entertained, and then how we get things, and then how we nourish ourselves through, like, whole foods integration and things like that. So all of that is yeah, really dramatic. And so where does that become? I mean, they would love it, I think, if they disappeared as an entity. Like if Amazon was so humanized, quote unquote, that we never thought about it, they would be thrilled. That's my sense. That, like if you never had to be aware of them existing, then that would be like the solution. That would be the kind of, total ubiquity would be like a kind of victory for Amazon, in the sense, because you would never be reminded, like, where I live, sometimes I see the third-party logistics delivery van system parking on the corner, and there are 20 people sorting out 500 boxes on the corner of a super busy intersection because of the pressures that Amazon puts on its third-party labor to quickly deliver all this stuff in an impossible way. So they're using this sort of totally treacherous place to then sort of sort out everything. So that's a moment of like friction in the system that Amazon probably does not like, but that's what they're producing. At the same time, if we consider other kinds of technological transformations like electricity or plumbing, there was like a moment when it was totally novel to have a wire in your wall that would let you turn on a light, or like totally novel that you could, like, water would come out of a pipe in your wall that you could drink. And so, is Amazon getting to that point where they're saying, we might imagine moving into a house or an apartment building that would be like integrated with special like Amazon portals, or something, and you'd have some sort of like special access to this infrastructure system. Is that science fiction, or is that silly, or is that different than moving into a house that was electrified? And I think this is a question for me that I don't know yet, but I think that my sense is that Amazon is pursuing these kinds of things at different scales. So whether or not that's sort of more human or not, I think it's more about, like, to what extent are we aware of a technological system being integrated into our daily life, and do we have agency in that process? Or is it something that we're sort of then compelled to accept?
Well, clearly, people have lots to ask you, and we are out of time, but you might want to just take a quick look at some of the chats you've gotten. I don't think we have time to really address it, but at least you can just see some of the interest that people are taking. So thank you so much, Jesse. We will bring you back for part 2 of this. Clearly, we need more.
Yeah.
And it's been great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for everyone for the questions and for listening. And you can find me on the website, or drop me a line if you want to talk more. I'm always interested in these conversations. So thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you to the school and to the audience.
Great, wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks. We'll let everybody get off.
Hey, Marcelo.
Hi.
Have you guys met, Marcelo and Sarah?
No,
so.
we haven't.
Thanks,
Marcelo's-
Jesse. Excellent.
Thanks.
Really loved it. Thanks so much. See you
Thanks
soon.
for
Take
sticking
care.
Take care.